Well, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to ANU and to this event that is jointly hosted by the Crawford School of Public Policy and the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. We've got a wonderful audience here in the law building here at ANU, as well as online, and we will bring everyone online, if you choose to do so, into the discussion as we go. My name is Jotzo. I'm professor with the Crawford School of Public Policy, and we're joined by a really fantastic panel here for the book launch of the newly published book, Regional Energy Transitions in Australia, From Impossible to Possible. We've been talking about energy transition for a long time. I remember events that we've held here at ANU maybe 10 years and longer ago, and certainly seemed more like a distant future prospect, speaking in hypotheticals. In the meantime, many of the things that we were talking about as possible future developments in terms of that rapid shift from coal to renewables in particular have in fact happened and have gathered pace over that time. So we acknowledge, of course, the traditional people of the lands who we meet on and work on and play on, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people in this case. And that's actually not just tokenistic, because in the end, when we talk about energy transition, when we talk about investments in new energy and industrial installations, right, this ultimately is a matter for local communities, for Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities. And it's the regional and the local change that is really driving some of the resistance to that change, but that's also driving our considerations collectively in this community as to how we best go about managing that energy transition so that it doesn't become a negative experience for local people who are directly affected by that, and so that it can become a positive experience in terms of the economic prosperity in the regions that see that change happen. So the book that is being launched, that's being launched for the second, third, or fifth time, in fact. We're very privileged, of course, to have one of these launches here in Canberra at ANU, is edited by Amanda Cahill and John Wiseman. We'll have John Wiseman say a few words as well. Amanda will kick us off, and then we'll have a really free-flowing discussion in the panel. Our panel consists of David Shankey, who's the CEO of the Net Zero Economy Authority, and joined not too long ago from a senior exec position in Queensland government. Amanda Cahill, of course, who's the CEO, in fact, outgoing CEO, I should say, of the Next Economy, a really terrific organization that has done tremendous work in fostering understanding of the energy transition, in particular in Queensland, but really nationwide and with a lot of international engagement as well. We've got Bec Colvin on the panel, of course, associate professor colleague here at Crawford School, whose work on community attitudes and local transition is really very prominent in this field. And we're very fortunate as well to be joined by Jo Evans, a dear friend of the ANU, and quite immediate former Deputy Secretary in charge of climate policy issues with the Department of Climate Change and Energy. And so with that, have I forgotten to say anything, Amanda? No, Amanda is really the one in charge. And so Amanda, let's have you give your introduction to the topics and the books.
Thank you.
Welcome, Amanda.
Hi everyone, can you hear me okay up the back? Great. Thank you, Frank and Bec and ANU for hosting this event. It's really exciting to be here. I was a graduate student here and did my PhD across the road in the Coombs building, so it's always a bit strange to come back to ANU. I'd also like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and that we're meeting on unceded land. Also want to acknowledge that some of the authors in the Collie chapter in the book were First Nations and leaders and elders as well, bringing their voices into this discussion about the energy transition. I'd like to thank the panelists for joining us, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation this evening. But I also want to acknowledge that there's a lot of familiar faces in the room and people who've been playing an active role in the energy transition in lots of different places. So that's actually been quite a theme of all of the events that we've run. It's been really nice to see people with an industry background, local government background, civil society unions, environment groups, and different levels of government actually coming together, who've all been part of this kind of jigsaw of the energy transition over decades, really, when you look at it. So my job here is to give you a short synopsis of the book over the next 10 minutes or so. And I guess I'll start with why we decided to do it. Initially, there was a discussion between John and Gareth and I about, was there something in this about writing up the work, particularly post-2022? My motivation at the time was I was actually getting really annoyed. So this book, for me, came out of frustration on two parts. One, that people started talking about the energy transition as if it was always just going to happen. Like, of course, places like the Hunter and Gladstone, they're forward thinking. They know that things change. So, of course, they were just going to get on and do this, right? I was like, oh, my God, do they know how much work went in behind the scenes with unions, local government, industry players, environment groups? Like, all of the people who've been working on this for the previous 10 years flashed before my eyes. The second frustration I had was that the story also internationally became, we had a change of government, Labor came in, and all of a sudden everything just moved and the money just moved. And again, I knew that a lot of the policy ideas and some of that research that was being used at a federal and state government level had actually been developed in regions and by different groups and different think tanks. So there was a motivation to put the record straight and to actually honour all of the different work that had been done. So we went to groups across the 5 major coal regions that we knew in Port Augusta, Collie, Latrobe Valley, Hunter and Central Queensland and said, are you interested in being part of this book and telling your story? And most of the chapters have been written by a combination of academics and practitioners from across different, often civil society groups. The focus of the book is mainly, we asked them to focus very much on that period between 2010 and 2022, when things seemed impossible and almost you couldn't really talk about climate change, let alone start talking about what that energy mix would look like. And to talk about what was actually happening in the regions, what were the conversations that were happening, what efforts were happening around planning, what were some of the challenges and what were some of the turning points. So while the intention was to set the record straight, it's actually been a really joyous experience, and particularly the book launches and visiting places and seeing how much pride people have in their story being told. Because a lot has been achieved, and it's a really interesting history, not just around energy, but in a way, how Australia's been grappling with climate. So I want to share some of the key insights that have emerged and leave you with a couple of challenges that I see emerging again as we move forward. The first point is kind of an obvious one, but it actually is a really tricky one, particularly for policymakers to deal with. And that is that the energy transition is essentially local. The way it plays out in each place is different. They have a different history, they have a different mix of opportunities and challenges. And so they need bespoke approaches at a time where we want to move faster and we need sort of policies and investment instruments that are going to work across the board. There's also a need to slow down and actually talk to people and actually understand the intricacies of that situation that they're in. Similar point is that timing really matters. And this was a surprising point for me. But when you actually read the book, we organise each region sort of chronologically as to some key tipping points where the energy transition conversation really got going. So when you read the chapters in order, you see that depending on when things really started to move in the energy transition, there were very different opportunities available to people. So anyone who was involved in the climate movement 10 years ago would have known about Port Augusta, and as this really inspiring story of like the Australian Youth Climate Coalition coming together with people on council and Beyond Zero Emissions to come up with a vision for Port Augusta around the power station, like before the power station even started to close. They wanted to be a renewable energy powered hub, and they opened their doors to renewable energy investors. And that worked to attract people in. but they didn't think through how they could capture that moment and that investment to treat it as a regional economic development opportunity, make sure that money stayed in the community. So in some ways they won, in other ways they lost out. Whereas Latrobe Valley, very different story, had some really great support post the announcement of the closure of the Hazelwood Power Station, with the Latrobe Valley Authority starting up, which was kind of the first of its kind, but happened after the closure, and so faced other kinds of challenges in trying to respond to that closure. The Hunter and Gladstone was looking like regions like that came a bit later. They could see what had happened in those regions, and so they're a bit more on the front foot of going, maybe we should start to plan this out before the closures happen. That's led to them getting a lot more different kind of support and investment into more proactive plans into their future. So in a way, they're set up to actually capture more of those jobs and investment coming a bit later. So it's different depending on the timing. And I think the other thing is with that is that we need different kind of leadership. As you see the timing changing over that sort of 10, 12-year period, different kinds of leadership needed to emerge at different points to respond to different challenges. When it was basically impossible in coal communities to talk about the energy transition, it fell to unions and environment groups and community groups, so civil society, to put their hand up and say, well, it's our community, we want to have a conversation about how we're going to manage change. That started to shift around 2021, where the threats economically started to be real to local governments, but also some of the opportunities around things like green hydrogen started to be talked about. So then we saw the conversation shift towards industry leaders and local government. In the last couple of years, there's been a lot more formal initiatives by government, and we've seen the development of the Net Zero Economy Authority, the National Reconstruction Fund Authority. In New South Wales, we've got the Future Jobs and Investment Authority. So there's more formalised processes around how do we actually approach this challenge. But just as things start to flow, it's starting to look shaky again. There's a lot of uncertainty in regions, particularly in the lead up to this election, and it's starting to get difficult again to have this conversation, and the fear is palpable. So again, it's starting to be, again, civil society coming in to host that conversation. We need to invest in leadership across the board because we're going to need different leadership in the times to come. It's going to continue to be rocky for a while. In that, a strengths-based approach is another theme of the book that is crucial to keep hold of. The starting point to bring people together to get past that polarisation is to start a conversation about what people care about and what they have to work with. This is the key to economic diversification as much as it is about community sense of pride and agency. And we need to remember how much progress has been made in a relatively short period of time. Probably over 40% renewable energy generation now. I think it was 46 in the last quarter alone. There's a whole lot of new manufacturing opportunities that are being invested and built as we speak. And challenges remain. We have more formal attempts to support the transition, which is great. And we need to make sure that that's inclusive of a lot of groups that don't often get invited into the room. How do we make sure that people who have been excluded from economic development for a long time actually can take advantage of the fact that we've got shortages of skills and that we need to build renewable energy? How do we make sure we involve more women in the energy sector? Traditional owners actually see the benefits of this. People who've been long-term unemployed, small and medium-sized enterprises, not just large industries cashing in on this. Yes, workers need support. Yes, we need to get money to industry, but we need to take an ecosystem approach to this and bring everyone along on that. Second, managing transition means investing in the foundations on which economic development depends. For so long, it's been about how do we get money to the right industries who are going to create those jobs. But the book really points to the fact that there's a lot more that needs investment. We need the training institutions. We need investment in universities, which is a pretty topical issue here right now. We need health services. In Gladstone, it was like industry saying, well, we could invest in a green hydrogen industry here, but actually you don't have the health facilities to deal with an emergency if something blows up, which is quite amazing given the amount of industry already in Gladstone. How do we have aged care and childcare services so women can actually participate? What infrastructure upgrades are needed, and how do we make sure that the cost of those don't fall on local governments? If we invest well, this is an opportunity to build stronger and more resilient regions. But we've got to invest well. We also need to invest in civil society at a time where rights are becoming strained. We're seeing backlash and sliding in places with strong leadership and vision in the book. Things are quickly becoming more polarised again. How do we build accountability and power at a local level to hold our institutions to account and lock in the commitments that have been made? How do we keep engaging the community around a strong and clear vision and a story about who we are as a country, why we need to transition, what people's role is in that, how they can have a say in what happens, and how we can hold the line and double down on what is needed in the face of some pretty challenging political trends that we're seeing all around the world. Where we've seen this kind of leadership, and the book really shows this, we can see that action can happen quite quickly. And on that note, again, I just want to acknowledge the people in the room who have stuck their necks out over the years to take that action and to say thank you. It's been a delight to be in these conversations, and I look forward to where we land today. So thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Sophia. And Amanda, I think a collective thank you to you, actually, as a major driver in this community in terms of rallying people around these ideas and creating ideas in this space as well as founder of the next panel as well. Can I invite our panel to take a seat at the front? And so what we'll do is, like, I'm so super excited about the collection of people we have in the room today, right? And we are making sure we'll have a lot of time for free-flowing conversation. So please engage in that. And like I said before, plenty of opportunity for online to be included as well. Do you want me to sit down there?
Which
is easier? Okay, I will move down there. So let's get the conversation started. Bec, if you're right to kick us off. You've been working in the energy transition space, and in particular in terms of community attitudes and local community transition, respectively and natural, for some time now. And you've led different research projects on this. So is there anything that you can distill from all of those experiences? And I would invite all of the panelists also to share any ideas and comments that you might have on what Amanda explained to us just now.
Thanks, Frank, and hi, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here. If I can distill something from, maybe I'll put it on having read the book, it's definitely worth reading the book. So hopefully pick a copy up, because it's quite inspiring, and it's also, like, it does have some elements of being a blueprint. And a few of the things that I really took from it relate to the importance of the local context, as Amanda was saying, but also understanding not just local context as in, like, how do we take the set of ideas that we've got and make it work in some particular area, but how do you start from the story that makes sense from the perspective of the communities in that local area, and then think, what does energy transition or regional transition, industrial transition mean to these communities? I think repeatedly, if I can say there's something that might be an easy mistake or perspective to take that leads us down a road that's less useful than other roads, is for those of us that are kind of obsessed with energy and climate and working in the space and academia and policy. So we'll often find a community and we'll go, this community is super relevant for energy transition, and we see them through that lens as if it comes to define so much about what it means to be someone who lives in that place and has being in that place part of who they are. So to the extent that we can try to step out of our own position and then look back on things like energy transition from the community perspective, we do a lot better. But that also means a bit of humility and not thinking we can easily understand and pigeonhole particular people. It kind of relates to another theme that I was hoping to talk about that came through in the book, which is the way in which there were some key events, and I'm thinking in particular of the Stanwell CEO's comment in your chapter on Gladstone, that really enabled a whole lot of people to start expressing opinions that prior to that point had been not permissible to express. And this seems to be coming through, like some work that I did in the Upper Hunter a few years ago. A whole lot of folks were saying, you know, I want to be talking about energy transition. I want to plan for the future, but everyone else is so extreme that I either want to shut down coal yesterday, all of it, they don't care about the consequences, or they think that it's going to run forever. And the funny thing was, every single person I spoke to said effectively the same thing. I'm alone in seeing that there is some conversation that needs to happen here. And so we have these multiple levels of which the ways that communities and society more generally engage with issues operate. One of those levels are what are our individual views, shaped as they are by the societies around us. Then sitting above that, like a cloud, are kind of like the social norms of a place, what we think are the views that are acceptable to express. And this changes a lot, and you can have these kind of watershed moments that shift it. And this is where the book shows so powerfully that they don't just happen most of the time. They happen from a whole lot of work and a whole lot of kind of the behind the scenes relationship building and trust building work. So I think there's a lot to be said there for work that happens with communities, understanding them from within the communities rather than being something that is kind of added on from the outside. Maybe I'll zip it there and pass it on.
Thank you. That was very good.
I've got questions.
Yeah, I'll just
you can't just jump in. What's a prepared question for me?
I didn't have one. No one's hearing your joke.
He's teasing me because I said to him at lunch, I'm like, so did you get the run sheet? He's like, run sheet? There's a run sheet? You know, I'm just going to ask whatever I want. I'm like, that's fine. I'm okay with it.
And so in fact we'll go to you, John.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's right. So John, look, you've been in senior positions in the Department of Climate Change and Energy and its predecessor versions under several governments. You've seen a lot of change, right? And you've seen a lot of policy development, and I think a lot of change in political attitudes to policy on energy transition. Can you share with us some of the perhaps the pivotal moments in that journey as to how policy has changed at the federal level? And can you maybe also share with us some observations about what kind of elements or points in time or events make significant change in policy attitudes and policy practice possible?
Right. Maybe before I actually answer your questions, I'll just say that the book is fabulous. You should definitely get a copy and read it. From my perspective, the thing that it is so good, what is so good about it is it's just a very warts and all description of the way these different communities have handled the pressures that are on them. And find ways to go forward. And you know, Bec was saying like it takes leadership and so on to get to these places where you can start to see the change. The other thing I think the book does really well is that it points to how fragile those consensus moments can be, and it feels like, you know, feels like we are kind of entering another moment where what felt like a stable place is going to go back to being a bit unstable for a while. But yes, so I have worked in this space for a long time. I'm still sort of using the mantle of former Deputy Secretary because I haven't figured out how to refer to myself in my post-APS career, but I've been out of the public service now since last September. And I think if I look at the political shifting moments, perhaps in the last little while, Bec referred to how difficult it is to have certain conversations in communities. Well, certainly, as a public servant and working within the government for a long time leading up to the sort of Morrison prime ministership, it was very difficult to actually even talk about climate change openly. And in fact, I remember being really excited because we were collaborating a lot with the Department of Defence, and they had been able to talk about climate change. I don't think they were using those specific words, but they were talking about the changes in the climate as they prepared their resilience strategies and so on. And so we were really pleased to get that sort of leg up. And then there was a bunch of investment in the National Resilience Framework that enabled us to have a conversation about climate change without talking about climate change. So it was that difficult in that era. And then a few things happened, you know, the sort of long drought and to some extent the fires, although, you know, I remember some pretty pointed conversations where we thought there was an opportunity to use the sort of reality of climate change that had become so stark through that event to see whether we could really move some things forward. And the sort of political reaction at the time was, no, it'll blow over, which was, you know, it was quite confronting. So there was that, and then we sort of entered into the phase where there was this sort of growing realisation that the community and the voting public actually wanted the government to commit to net zero emissions. And how do you help the government navigate a transition from where they had been to a point where they could embrace a goal of net zero, which they did do. That was the coalition sort of prior to the 2022 election. And, you know, what's significant about that, and so I'm sort of jumping around a bit in terms of things I wanted to say, but that doesn't matter. I'll just ramble for a while and stop me if you're doing too long. So in that moment, there was a lot of work done behind the scenes, and in a lot of ways, the themes that were a part of that work are the same themes that are present in the current government policy suite and the same themes you're seeing in the regional transition. It was, you know, where are the comparative advantages for Australia in the future in a carbon-constrained world? Where are they? How do we build them? You know, and what investments are necessary to actually get there? And if you do get there, can you also get to net zero? All of those sorts of things. So they're all the same questions. But I guess I would characterise the way that the place that the coalition got to is a commitment to the intent. Yes, we need to be there, but kind of maybe a lack of willingness to actually put the policy instruments in place to drive towards that outcome. And the shift that happened in the 22 election was with Labor coming in, and the objective's still the same, still going to get to net zero, but now all of a sudden you had a government that is actually willing to very explicitly put policies in place to construct that. And I think, you know, you've reflected on, to some extent, I think, but, you know, there will be differences of view about this out there. That did provide a kind of much clearer sense of direction and pathway to what we were trying to achieve. And I think that right now, with the sort of advent of the election and sort of some doubt about where it might go, or if there was a return to coalition government, there's a lot of uncertainty about what that would do to these specific policy changes that have been made, and I think it had a positive impact on the way that communities have been able to embrace the discussion about the transition. So yeah, but I do want to I wanted to make a couple of other points and then I'll stop. So Amanda already made the point that there's been so much progress, like there has been so much progress, and if you look at the electricity sector in particular, you really see it, 40% renewables, these sorts of things. But the place, and you see it in the emissions as well, emissions in our electricity sector have genuinely plummeted. But in the energy sector, so once you look at the industrial sector, emissions are growing. They have still been, you know, up 20% since 2005. And so there's still a really long way to go. And while there's been a lot of, like, so that, you know, what have we done? What's happened that's good is there are frameworks now in place. Hopefully some of them will survive. So there's been some regulation, there's been sort of explicit mapping of the electricity sector, there's been frameworks and sort of strategies, plans put in place for things like developing hydrogen in the economy, even the Future Made in Australia architecture, which at one level it feels like that's a big point of contention between the current government and the potential coalition government. And yet the objectives are sort of the same. They both want exactly those industries to grow in this country. But so that architecture has been built, but I guess what we haven't yet seen is the really tangible changes on the ground that will help the region say, actually, yeah, we've got it, we can see how this is actually going to work for us. And so that's, you know, that's still to come, and I would hope if it was a return Labor government, I think the survival of that, all of that architecture might enable some of those early signs of progress to start coming through. And then the only other thing I wanted to make a comment on was the issue about community engagement, bringing communities along, and there's been maybe two angles on it. One is, I've reflected a lot on the quite polarised discussion that's emerged around offshore wind, and a reflection that sort of when, so I was responsible at the time for sort of kicking off the process of saying we should have a framework in place to manage offshore wind, because at the time we had sort of one company that was knocking on the door saying we really want to look at this, and to enable them to even look at it, like to even start a conversation. It was an absolute administrative nightmare. We had to get permission from about 12 different agencies, and it was impossible. And so we said we need a regulatory framework around this to enable it to happen, which is now there. And nothing's happened. There are no offshore wind farms even sort of concretely put forward yet. And yet the political mayhem that has started to happen around it is really, well, from my point of view, frustrating. Like, what you really do want us as a nation to get better at being able to just actually talk about whether this is an option for a region or not. Yeah. And then last thing, sorry, totally different topic, is the engagement of First Nations one. When in 2022 there was a moment which we collectively seized as public servants and for the government as well, to say we really needed a conversation about clean energy and First Nations. And that's going, it's happening. But I think it has got there's a lot of fraught, it's fraught, it's dangerous because there's so many expectations, and there's such a high probability potential to get it wrong. So I guess there's something in this about, want to engage with the community, you want to make it work, and yet we layer all these expectations on top of the energy transition, and you're worried it might end up sinking under its own weight. So anyway, I've rambled a bit. I should stop and let Dave talk, or let Frank ask his question, but we'll come back to any of those.
Speaking of political mayhem, if you've had the pleasure or misfortune to listen to today's debate between the Energy Minister and the Shadow Energy Minister, you would have been reminded just how little discussion there is of common ground and how much discussion there is of differences or perceived differences. But in the end, whoever is in government after May, after the election, will be grappling with the same problems, of course, right? And some of, one of those problems will be closure of coal-fired power stations. And you're in caretaker mode, right? So we won't put you on the spot in terms of comment on government policy or anything like that. But the question I would like to ask is, where do you see, what do you see as the issues that will really need to be sorted over the next 5 years? And what will be the role for federal government, and including, of course, the authority, in helping sort them in that energy transition, and in particular, the decline of existing assets, in particular coal-fired power stations?
Thank you. I will come to that, and I'll just offer some reflections as well on, the book and the time in Queensland, particularly that Gladstone experience.
Read it.
I was definitely there in the department at that time, and I remember when Richard Van Brader, the CEO then of Stanwell, had sort of said, I can't remember the exact words, but it was something like, of course the coal-fired power stations will close down.
No, he didn't say they'll close down. He said into the future we'll have to figure out how to operate more flexibly with renewable energy coming into the mix.
It's shocking.
Yeah, shocking.
and within government, it did spark an absolute panic of like, what has he said? And how can the Queensland government maintain these assets and keep having income, and we haven't had any decisions from it. And Richard stopped, he wasn't working about a month later.
2 days later.
2 days later, there you go. It felt like a month, but
It sure did.
crumbled, crushed into a couple of days. But, it is important to note that, sort of, it started a conversation within the Queensland government. So even though externally it looked like all of this has been shut down, it kind of started this dialogue about, well, what actually really are we going to do? What does this storage mean, putting it into storage? And then if we are thinking about putting it into storage, what does it actually mean for the long term? And, and out of that came the process of doing the Queensland Energy and Jobs Plan. And, the same minister that was involved in that person no longer having a job, just last night receives an award for services to climate and that kind of thing. And I'm not taking away from that award at all. I'm just sort of saying that that moment was a turning point, and it is important to reflect on the fact that that sometimes the darkest night is just before the dawn, and those moments can be very significant, even though they're quite painful for some of the individuals involved. So I wanted to share that reflection, but also then sort of add in thinking of the future. I think when most of us in government were thinking about how to solve the climate problem and the deployment of renewables, it was approached along with our Treasury colleagues as simply a financing bridging problem. And that we had to solve that problem of that renewables are very expensive upfront, and you've got to deploy capital into them, and we've come up with all sorts of remarkable, pretty good mechanisms to do that. But it hasn't been that long into the fast pace of deployment where the penny has dropped that it's not actually a financial problem, not just a financial problem, but half the challenge that we face is that this is not my term, but we will transition at the speed of trust. Like the trust that we maintain in communities will dictate how fast or slow that we do this. So, I am pleased to be part of the NZEA now, because I do sort of see that it has a role in hopefully becoming an institution that is operating in these communities for long periods of time, and governments are not good at that. Like the problem I think that we have faced is a complete absence of consistency at state levels and Commonwealth levels. And the more institutions that we can put in place, like the CCA, that have an endurance, and that communities can see that they will be there for a longer time, for a long period, the more chance we have to keep that trust. But it's still, I think, pretty early days. It's an incredibly fragile moment because people are feeling so uncertain about the direction and the where the world is going, and the impact of the Ukraine on energy prices, and it's been challenging. Cost has been a real challenge in the system over the past couple of years. So all those things have been very challenging to that trust thing. And, I see that it's important for government to be responding to that with certainty where it can. And institutional certainty is a really important part of that.
We'll come back to those qualified observations.
Okay.
Discussion. And of course, just to acknowledge, we have some of the senior leadership of the Climate Change Authority here in the audience. I'm counting on you, friends, to come in on the conversation. And just as we open up to questions, please do signal to me quite clearly if you want to have the microphone. Annetta is going to be the voice of the online audience, and we'll invite Professor John Wiseman, one of the editors long-time great in this field in Australia. Oh, you've got your own microphone here. John, please share your reflections.
Just a couple of things. Thank you, Frank. First thing I'd like to do is thank Amanda and also our other co-editor, Gareth Edwards, who I think is online. It's been a fantastic co-editing experience. But I also want to thank, they may be online, some of the people who contributed to the chapters, because I don't know how many of you have edited books of multiple authors, but it's not always a straightforward, easy process. And this had its ups and downs, but basically the generosity of all the people from all the regions was fantastic. And I think that's, I really would like to highlight that. Frank talked about, I think we've all been at events over the last 5, 10, goodness knows how many years, and on this topic, and I can think of one in particular, just near here actually at ANU about 5 or 6 years ago, and it was a moment at which the conversation about climate and energy was tough, and we wondered, the speakers there kind of wondered, well, how are we going to move this along? Could we just rely on changes in renewable energy prices? That would be important, but that wasn't going to be the whole story. So government leadership at all levels was going to be crucial. Some people talked about the importance of developing institutions, maybe called something like the NZEA. But the dominant, I think the strongest continuing theme was the one about the importance of respectful conversations with communities, noting Amanda's point about all energy transitions are local, and listening to and respecting those local voices is really been critical. I really liked the point too about trust. I think that's a word that keeps coming up. So it's great to see, through the book, through this conversation, a sense of many of these key drivers of the transition, of a just transition, if you like. There's been significant progress for sure. I think all the panelists have hinted at some of the concerns we would all be aware of. Some people call them headwinds. I think perhaps if you look at what's coming out of the White House, a stronger word might be useful, but the geopolitical, financial, economic headwinds that we're all dealing with, and what that means in terms of uncertainty, the weaponisation, I think, by some interests of entirely understandable community concerns about cost of living and about the impact of sometimes not terribly well planned renewable energy projects. We all understand that, but there's a risk in that being weaponised in various ways at the moment. And of course, in the background, the ongoing impacts of rising CO2, the climate crisis, fires and floods and storms and so on, which are all part of this context. So I'm sure they're all issues that people will want to talk about, and the panel as well. If we have time, Frank, I'm keen to throw one question back to the panel. If we were sitting here in 5 years' time, and Amanda and I and Gareth had been perhaps foolish enough to try and edit a follow-up book. This book was called very deliberately From Impossible to Possible, and I think it's a great title. My challenge is for us all to think about what we would hope the title of a book in 5 years' time might look like, and maybe even a more potent and powerful title than From Impossible to Possible. But thank you to Frank, and thanks to everyone for the work on this book.
Thanks, John. Can you take us on the question?
I just wanted to really acknowledge the work that both John and Gareth did. I'm a co-editor, but it was really John and Gareth. So when we had this idea of the book, I was like, I'm totally swamped. You guys are going to have to carry this. Are you okay with that? And they really have, and particularly Gareth did a lot of the editing. So a lot of the polished, easy reading, people could say, oh, it's really easy, it's enjoyable, was down to John and Gareth. So I just wanted to mention that. And in terms of the title, or response?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the great hope is it's from possible to boring.
Yeah.
Because you actually want the energy transition to become so part of life and so part of our economy, and so that it is no longer this, so it becomes a consistent change, that it is no longer this bugbear or however it is for us, every day.
Yeah, I was going to say maybe the title is "Look, Mum, No Coal."
Yeah.
But I just wanted to sort of say a couple of other things before we go to other questions too, which is one is this issue about the way that communities are reacting. I talked about political mayhem, but the communities are genuinely concerned. Like it's not like there's no problem there. It's a genuine fear. And the part of it that's been frustrating is, I guess, the willingness to use that fear for political purposes.
Yeah.
But the fear is definitely there, and engaging with it properly and not too quickly. Like this, you know, it's been great to see a lot of progress in the last few years, but also some of it's been too fast for some of the communities to keep up with. There was that, and then the other one is we're talking a lot about the energy transition, as we should, and renewables and how much it's coming into Australia, but that is not the only thing affecting these regional communities, and maybe it's all part of the energy transition when you see it at a really macro level globally, but you know, some of the impacts not on the coal-fired power stations, but on the coal export industries, gas export industries, all of those things are coming no matter what we do about renewables or nuclear in Australia. And so the questions about what's going to happen to the regions and how to transition those workers and so on is real, no matter what happens on the 3rd of May. Absolutely.
Thanks, Jerry. If I can pick up just a bit on the community discomfort or disquiet with some of the changes. Something that's on my mind is some great work that was done by a colleague of ours last year, Eleanor Buckley. She went out to Western Victoria to engage with the community that had organised in kind of a local-based renewables opposition movement. And this was such incredibly valuable research because it's very difficult to get access to these communities to try to understand them better, with these types of groups, so the lack of trust. Why would they want a university researcher to come and talk to them? But Eleanor had existing connections and some existing trust that she gained that access. And something that many of the people there went to great lengths to emphasise to Eleanor was, we're nice, normal people. We just don't like what's happening here. And it was really that recognition that they perhaps get a picture of them as painted in the media that is like a caricature of some cruel, evil, nasty type of person that's out there. But often many of the same drivers behind communities that are resisting renewables infrastructure, the generation and the transmission that Jonathan is particularly interested in as well, it's very similar to the same sort of motives that have driven communities to oppose coal and gas projects too. So a big part, like when I'm thinking about a lot of the work that we need to do around navigating through this prickly, complicated social space, to me a big part of the answer is social repair, like rebuilding trust and respect and learning how to listen. The only other thing I just want to mention while I'm talking about Eleanor's research is that she found for a lot of these folks, when she asks them, what does it mean to you to be opposing the renewables infrastructure? And this was largely around VNI West, the transmission line that's going in. For them, the story started back in COVID. And this was a very Victorian flavour to the story, the dictator Dan storyline, which was the overreach of government. And to them, that same symbolism and that same moral injury is bound up in the transmission towers and the transmission lines. So they are opposed to the infrastructure for reasons to do with place and landscape impact and what they see as being appropriate and the decision that communities should have, but it has all of that extra weight to it of what it means for a government to be breaching the social contract. That's what it means to these folks, some of them. Oh, I thought I got out of that one.
I'll give you a book title that speaks to that, because I just really like the points that you're making there, because I think a lot of the opposition, we work in a lot of communities where there's opposition and they're dealing with multiple challenges at the same time. And underneath it, when you dig deep, it's really a question around what does good development look like. They've been on the receiving end of development that's being done to them, and they're dealing with new developments coming in that we don't always have good regulatory frameworks for, and so it is a bit messy. And it's not, so honesty around, yes, this is messy, there are going to be impacts, but is this an opportunity to actually look at how we do development, how we do planning? Because it's a mess, like it's state, local and federal level. So my title would be, is it transition to transformation? Have we actually addressed a whole lot of other issues that are across a whole lot of other things, not just around energy, housing?
That's better.
Right, John, we've got a job to do.
Water systems transformation.
Yeah.
We'll take the conversation to the room. Please feel free to introduce yourselves and where you're coming from. We've got 2 questions lined up, and Tim Holloway's first.
Yes, thanks very much, all of you, for a fantastic conversation, and Amanda for your incredible work. Look forward to reading the book. I wanted to dig into where you were already actually going just now, with this question of fear and legitimate opposition, but also the recognisation of that. And picking up, I guess, particularly, Joe, you mentioned the offshore wind farm issue, and we certainly know there's a whole lot of evidence being compiled by various folks around how there's a hell of a lot of astroturfing going on here. Yes, there's legitimate fear in the community, but a whole lot of this stuff is being deliberately weaponised and astroturfed by fossil fuel funded organisations like advanced and folks like that. You know, Amanda taught me a wonderful lesson when I was asking her ages ago about kind of how do you do this sort of work in the community, and this fundamental insight that you don't ask people to pick a side when you go into a community and you actually work out how to bring folks together. How do you manage then when you have bad actors who are deliberately weaponized? Do you have pathways that you can work out how you can insulate communities against that kind of work, how you can respond when there are bad actors deliberately whipping up legitimate fear?
I might start because we do work in communities where there's a lot of opposition and polarisation. That's why I started the Next Economy in the first place. And the reason I started it was because my experience that polarisation was happening in the media, but I was getting asked into the same communities that were being portrayed as completely polarised because they said, whatever happens, we care about our place, we care about our future, and we've got to find a way to manage this, and we've got to find a way to figure this out. I still think that's the case. I still think people, when you ground it in a conversation about where are we at, what do you care about, and this is about managing economic change, impacts and potential benefits, it shifts people into a different mindset. It's not about defending or, it's still hard though. There are communities where we've actually said, we don't think you're ready to have that conversation because things are so heightened at the moment. But what we can do is give you some advice around what the conversation we think you need or the work that needs to be done so you can start to think about that. So meet people with where they're at and what they care about can ground people in a different kind of mindset. But it is getting harder. There is deliberate misinformation that is my facts versus your facts, and that's the last couple of years post-COVID, and it's getting much harder to have that conversation.
Yeah, I don't know that I can add much to what you've said. So I think the experience in Max, I'm already a year out of date on the offshore wind thing, but even before I left, the experience was a bit similar. So even when there was a lot of negative media, and even when our town hall events and things would get a bit shouty, actually there was a lot of other people present who were prepared to have the kind of normal conversation, the kind of conversation you want to have. So it is partly just getting past that media blur of it, I guess. But maybe the only other thing is to come back to a comment about the pace at which these conversations happen.
Yeah.
And in the offshore wind space, I think, possibly with great political foresight, Minister Bowen wanted to get through the declarations process as quickly as possible. And the department did a brilliant job, I think, in meeting that expectation. But the kind of collateral damage is that, perhaps some of those conversations needed to take longer and haven't had the chance to play out in quite as much time as they needed.
I guess that's a really interesting point, because I think there's an assumption based on the resources experience that you can do that, like that people will put up with it, they'll be like, but it's for some reason with renewable energy, people are not putting up with it in a way that they would put up with mining. So there's a really interesting thing that I haven't quite got to the bottom of, but it seems like renewable energy is much more vulnerable than a project that's happened before.
Well, I was just wondering if you think that's because people think it's imposed from the city rather than, you know.
Bec will have something.
City will divide.
So I think your eyes opened as wide as mine at the enticement of that prospect to talk about. So it does seem to be a big, Eleanor's research, as mentioning before, one of the themes that was really present was this idea of green hypocrisy. Is it, we're being told that renewables are so good for the planet, so how can it possibly have any sort of environmental impact if that story is true? And that's difficult. That's not a narrative that mining or typical extractive industries would be held up against. The city-bush divide thing, so much going on with that. So Frank and I and another colleague at UQ put a paper out a couple of months ago where we were trying to find a measure of what is the difference between the views of city people and country people in Australia on climate. So we asked a handful of questions on climate and energy issues. Because we thought it's likely we would find a difference, we thought we should ask questions on other general social issues too. So we could say, if we find a difference, is it just on climate or is it on everything? And then when we looked at the data, there was no difference. My first thought was, I forgot how to analyse data, this is a disaster. But actually, it was just that's what the results were telling us. When we used postcodes of respondents to classify them into the Australian Bureau of Statistics remoteness structure, there was no statistically significant difference between the views of people from the city and the country on climate. We did find one item on which they differed, and the one item was agreement or disagreement with the statement, people from the city and the country are more different than they are similar. So where we had about 50% of people express more agreement than disagreement with that, people from country areas were almost twice as likely to agree with it. And so the point is it sort of goes to those different layers that social reality operates at. So we have these narratives about difference, which then lead to certain views being acceptable in different contexts. And that disguises the diversity of views, the full spectrum of views that are often present, like Joe talking about the shouty town halls, where you do have a whole lot of quiet people who won't join in the shouting, but they actually want to get information and they want to have conversations past that shoutiness as well. But the city-bush divide thing is really difficult because we have so many instances that create the kernel for the narrative that then snowballs from there. And I think that sort of speaks to these astroturfing misinformation type things that you're asking about, Tim, because so often you can, as soon as you have advocates for an issue, have some claim that can be shown to be false or it's cherry-picked, or it's taking a slant on it that might not be acceptable to others, that becomes the entry point for this person isn't trustworthy. And then that tars the messenger with that brush, and that becomes really difficult to get out of. It's a trust thing again.
Welcome to the Climate Change Authority, Eliza Morris.
Thank you, and thanks very much to the panel and the editors and authors. I'm very much looking forward to having a read of this book. I wanted to go to something that came up through the panel discussion around the progress that we've already made between impossible to possible. Joe was talking about the policy frameworks and the big changes that have happened since 2022, and David raised the institutional architecture that we've got in place now as well. And that just made me reflect on whether we are gapping, whether we've got gaps there that we need to address, or whether we're at the stage of accelerating and tweaking at the margins and overcoming the barriers to implementing what we've got. And I'm thinking of things like ratcheting safeguard baselines, addressing things like the rate of approvals, workforce shortages, supply chain issues. That's kind of peripheral, it's not a new policy instrument, it's not a new framework. So the question is really, do you think we have gaps in the policy and institutional architecture? And if so, where should an incoming government or return government direct their attention? Where should bureaucrats direct their attention to thinking about filling those gaps?
Do you want to?
You can go first.
I think it's a really good question, but I would think, I'm not sure about the solutions, but I certainly see the gap as being that the co-benefits aren't being delivered on, like that there was we did have a, we hoped and believed that the system that we were building is cheaper, better, greener, and it's not quite that's not matching the lived experience of what people are having. So, and we did, rightly or wrongly, talk about that this new industrial development that we'd be bringing to regional communities was going to give them a second life. That was the proposition. And so finding a way to bridge what was said and that reality is a big gap. I would say it's a chasm. And so because it's not just about consulting better or having better teas or that kind of thing, or construction methods being better. It's a lot more substantial than that. I suppose it's probably that if we are going to be building all of this in regional communities, they have to feel that they are benefiting more than the cities. They're putting up, and that's where it feels like the gap is that there's a lot of transmission lines being built and this infrastructure here that's going elsewhere. And so, it feels like something there.
Thanks, Eliza, for the question. I think in some ways you're coming at the question the question is about emissions reduction policies, but actually I think the answer is much more in the space that David's already sort of pointing to, which is the big gap is how do you genuinely use the muscle of the government to help the actual transitions that are going on in regional communities, because even though both sides of politics would love it if the new economy opportunities were all co-located with the declining economy opportunities, doesn't actually work out that way.
Or there's a gap in time,
or there's all those things, and so even though you can now sort of what has to happen, you can see some pathways forward. I do think there's still a gap in actually figuring out how to help finance and to support the transition to those new things. And even though, there's eye-watering amounts of money in a kind of historical context being put towards these things, it's not enough to really get the economy to where it needs to get to, and so that's still the gap. I think is essentially it's embracing this new concept of how do you generate an industrial policy in Australia that enables us to move to where we need to be,
or even a regional industrial.
Yeah. I think the thing that we hear is missing is whose job is it to coordinate in an ongoing way at a regional level. So we've got state and federal institutions now, and we're talking a short period of time. We've got to keep this in. Of course, we haven't seen huge new industries built in the last 3 years. It's going to take some time. It's going to be messy, but there's frustration at the moment, and it's been coming out in the book launches that things have been happening over here. You've got Port of Newcastle doing some stuff over here. You've got a council doing some stuff over here. You've got Hunter Renewal and Hunter Jobs Alliance doing stuff. It's not adding up. So people are saying it's got to be somebody's job to pull this together. Not that everyone's going to be singing from the same hymn sheet, but how do we do that when you've got federal and state government operating up here who have different jurisdictions, different limits on what they can and can't do? It's a different role for government, and it's been an honour and a privilege to be in the rooms with people at different government levels and different departments. We really tried to grapple with this and go, where are the spaces where we can actually figure this out and try and experiment, and it's going to be time will tell, and it's got to be bottom up and top down and across sideways as well. And this is challenging when we've had a stable system that's worked in a particular way. We need different models. But there are bits and pieces, there are ingredients in place.
It's really worthwhile acknowledging there's a lot of goodwill and commitment.
Absolutely.
And a lot of people have We've had questions rolling in online, and Aneta, will you synthesize a couple of them for us?
Sure. So there's one from Melanie Zhang, who's from Queensland. I think it's a question for Amanda. So wondering how successful the Next Economy Striking a New Deal initiative was, and if they are planning on having any more of these initiatives. Beyond that. Also, so we're finding that in central Queensland there are landholders who are just seeing dollar signs and are not challenging renewable energy companies enough. And so how do you think we can improve this in our regions? So landholders can be more empowered to challenge the conditions put on their platform.
Yeah, so just to explain the context behind Melanie's question, we've been working with a few different communities around some of the objections and some of the issues that are popping up around kind of the way things are set up when renewable energy is being developed. And so there's a lot of individual negotiation with landholders, often non-disclosure agreements, deals being done, but not necessarily requirements everywhere in every state in the same way, to open that up to looking at broader community benefits. And this is it's a space that's changing a lot, and government policy in different places is trying to catch up. So what we've been trying to, we've got a project that we're working with Realliance, FRRR and JSA Associates, going, well, what if we flipped this around? And yes, the approval processes are about, but what if we can identify some regions where we know renewable energy development is going to come in, and actually start doing the work with local governments and the community to go, these people are going to come to you and start asking you what you want. How do we actually help you understand what this process looks like, and where you've got opportunities to start to shape that, and you have the hard conversations before anyone starts doing negotiation. So we're right at the beginning of that process, and it's messy because in places we're working, there is already renewable energy development, so there's already been experiences where people have either been burnt or they've cashed in. So trying to actually get people to think about the range of community benefits, but also impacts that need to be managed to have that conversation is tricky, but that's what we've been trying to do. A really good example of that is Hay in Western New South Wales, Realliance and now the Next Economy have been working with the council there that says we want to be on the front foot of this. They've developed a framework and principles, so any developer that comes in, and you know what, industry love it, because the work's been done. They don't have, all 7 proponents don't have to now go in and do that level of community engagement. They can work with the council around identified priorities, actually see where they fit in on that. Now they're looking at a housing strategy. They're looking at how they manage climate impacts as part of that. So it's not just about energy. They're looking at how agriculture is changing. So deciding to bring in different elements of that and figure out how to do that in a more proactive way. But that's really tricky then to try and then work out how does that fit with different policy plans.
Please everyone respond, because this is the final round.
Is there any more questions?
Oh, now we're getting going. No, what? Quick summary of your question, like 10-word summary of your question, and we'll see how you're going to take it up. We really want to land it on time. Please.
Okay, I'll just shout. Yeah. My name's Mel Flanagan. I'm from York Studios. I'm a social justice advocate, transparency advocate, and I work a lot on mining, extractive industries issues. So a lot of this is really, I mean, the issues that we're dealing with is also a hangover for the mining industry, a lot of lack of participation and transparency. So I'm loving all of this conversation because I've been working in energy transition locally and globally as well. So my question to you is, I'm really excited to read the book. I don't do a documentary series because I think and I'm a filmmaker and I'm happy to help.
I think the regions would love that, and yeah, because again, each chapter has been written by people who've been intimately involved in that, and there are some excellent stories and excellent characters that need to be immortalised. And I think, and we're actually getting a lot of interest internationally. We couldn't get an Australian.
Who's going to play you in the film?
No, I don't need to be but the Australian, we couldn't get Australian publishers actually interested in this, and interesting, it was the UK that came to the table because they were starting to see things going backwards in Europe. So I think that story around how has Australia dealt with that in a really different political time we're getting a lot of interest from other countries too, so I think it'd be a great project if you can find funding.
Okay, we'll go really quick, gentlemen.
Hi there, my name is Mark Kelly. I'm a journalist with Carbon Pulse. I'm just curious about the debate that came out today between the two. It was very much a case of framed around cost of living and my modelling versus your modelling. I'm curious whether there will be an opportunity again to move the national conversation back to emissions reductions and how to get there and staying in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement, and how to get there and the actual technical steps needed to achieve that, as opposed to the level of debate that we're seeing at the moment, which is quite surface level and slightly short-sighted.
And before you answer, there's another online question.
Yep, so this one from the old web. And so is there any examples of regions where an overall consensus of future direction has been emerging, and what is called this? So
Global consensus.
consensus of the transition positions.
Okay, final words on any of the above.
I'll try a political question. I can, I know. I don't know that we're ever going to get away from that sort of constant bickering about, you said it was going to be this and you haven't, and that's sort of where the political sort of play gets stuck. But no matter which colour of government we have after the 3rd of May, they will face a moment where they have to articulate what their next commitment is under the Paris Agreement. So I think that will bring it back to the discussion about, okay, what can we do? And it's like, this is the thing, is what can we achieve as Australia up against? Like there's genuine need to bring the communities along, so there's a pacing issue. You can't just kind of drop everything to zero immediately and expect the community to be 100% happy around that. So I think that that will be the forcing mechanism to bring the conversation back. But unfortunately, I think the modelling debate is going to live on, because no matter which one gets through, they've both used modelling. You know, the whole nuclear stuff, when they talk about the percentage reduction, it's all relative to some modelled baseline. So it's going to be back into exactly the same territory. Sorry to be pessimistic on that front.
But a successful community.
Yeah, successful community. Let's land on an optimistic note.
Oh, well,
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about what you were talking about, Jo. But I guess I would just mention, I'm thinking about these debates, sometimes, like when nuclear re-emerged into public discussion, there was quite a lot of groaning from people, I suppose understandably, who'd say, we've moved on from this, why do we have to have this conversation again? And that might be the case for people in the energy space, but it's not the case for folks that are like your everyday people. And I think something that is sort of a responsibility for all of us that like to be informed about what's in the ISP and what are the costs and the trade-offs is to be patient with people who are just trying to find their way through all of these competing forms of modelling, where it's inventing predictions about the future based on assumptions about what's going to happen and comparing to it, exactly like you're saying. Like, most people want to understand the world in a form that they believe to be a true reflection of reality. And so we need to be patient with those who start heading down a pathway that leads them toward topics that we might not want to talk about.
Successful community.
Successful community. So I think the book is a really good grounding reminder that this is going to be messy and it involves so many different things that you're not going to have. I don't think you're going to have, maybe in hindsight, in 20 years' time, we'll go look back at, of course, that community all worked out. But it's not that simple with dealing with the transformation of an economy. It's not just one sector. We've been talking about energy, but it's not just energy. It's industrial processes. It's our workforce. It's like there's a lot of things going on at the same time. I always go back to the Spain example because what I liked about it when I visited was the national government did come up with a plan. They had criteria around how they wanted the transition to play out. They tied public money to certain criteria like environmental standards and number of women in employment and SMEs and circular economy and stuff like that. But then they resourced the regions to also come up with a 5-year plan and said, here's the parameters, and they resourced it. And they resourced the research that went behind it so people could make some informed decisions. And separate to that, they also then had a separate process for negotiating with workers and industry and had a process of bringing different stakeholders together. They also made the regions responsible for monitoring progress and also around the allocations of funds and how they got decided. Now, it's not perfect, it's messy there too, but they are shutting down the nuclear industry and the coal industry. They've successfully closed down the coal industry there. They're shutting down nuclear next, and they are not wavering from those goals. Now, it's a different context, they've got different things working in their favour, but it was a concerted effort to kind of go, right, we're going to set the direction at the top, but we're going to work with you to figure out what this means in your particular region, and we're going to keep that going on a long-term basis.
5 year plans, I don't know. David, you're going to see us out with
I was just going to sort of say, I think we need to be thinking about these things similar to what other economic disruptions that we've had in the past. And, you know, governments have been successful sometimes in handling those economic disruptions. What's worst about it is that we don't do evaluation very well, apart from what you're always did very well. But, you know, that is the template.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us at ANU. Please come back. I gather there's refreshments in the corridor. Do buy it. No. It says on the run sheet. It says on the run sheet. I read the run sheet. This is ANU and there's no refreshments.